The old mechanic's hands were steady as he tightened the last lug nut on the stranger's flat tire. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows over the empty road. Gravel crunched under his boots as he stood, wiping sweat from his brow. The woman he'd stopped to help, a jittery thing with wide eyes, kept glancing over her shoulder like she expected trouble. He didn't ask questions. He'd seen enough hard luck in his 60-odd years to know when someone just needed a hand. "There you go," he said, patting the tire. "Safe to drive now?" She barely nodded, already sliding into the driver's seat. But before he could step back, a black SUV roared around the bend, its tire squealing as it slammed to a stop 10 feet away. Dust billowed around it, and the tinted windows stared at them like dark, unblinking eyes. The woman froze, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. "You shouldn't have stopped," she whispered, her voice trembling. Then she gunned the engine and peeled out, leaving him coughing in her dust. He squinted at the SUV, heart thudding a little faster. It didn't move, just sat there, engine rumbling low. He turned and trudged back to his pickup, feeling the weight of its gaze on his back. Hours later, he was home, sipping coffee in his quiet kitchen, when headlights sliced through the curtains. He peeked out and saw it, that same black SUV, parked right at his curb. Its engine growled in the stillness, and the night suddenly felt a whole lot colder. The mechanic stood frozen at his living room window, coffee mug still warm in his hand. The black SUV idled outside, its headlights cutting through the dark like a predator's stare. He squinted, trying to make out a shape behind the tinted glass, but saw nothing, just shadows. His old farmhouse sat at the edge of town, surrounded by fields and silence, and he'd always liked it that way. Now, that silence felt heavy, like it was hiding something. He set the mug down and rubbed his hands together, calluses rough against his skin. The clock on the wall ticked past 10. He'd spent his life fixing things, cars, tractors, even people's problems when they'd let him. But this? This felt different. The woman's whispered words, "You shouldn't have stopped," echoed in his head. What had he stumbled into? A sharp knock rattled the front door, and he nearly jumped out of his boots. He took a slow breath, telling himself it was probably nothing, just some late-night traveler needing directions. But his gut twisted as he shuffled to the door and cracked it open. A man stood there, tall and lean, wrapped in a dark coat that swallowed the porch light. His face was sharp, eyes hidden under the brim of a hat. Without a word, he held out a photograph, yellowed and creased at the edges. The mechanic took it, frowning. It showed a young boy, maybe 6 or 7, standing by a rusted bike, grinning at the camera. The kid's face didn't ring any bells. "Who's this?" the mechanic asked, his voice gruff. The stranger tilted his head, like he was sizing him up. "You don't know what you've started," he said, low and deliberate. Then he turned, coat flapping as he walked back to the SUV. The engine growled to life, and the vehicle rolled away, taillights fading into the night. The mechanic shut the door, locking it tight, and sank into his armchair. He held the photo under the lamp, studying it. The boy's smile was bright, but something about the picture gnawed at him, a memory he couldn't grab hold of. He'd lived a quiet life since retiring, tinkering in his garage, sipping coffee with old buddies at the diner. Sure, he'd had his share of rough patches, losing his wife to cancer 10 years back, the long nights that followed, but nothing that tied him to a kid like this. Or a black SUV. He leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. The day replayed in his mind, the lonely road, the woman's shaky hands, the way she'd bolted when that SUV showed up. He'd just been driving home from the hardware store, a bag of bolts rattling in the passenger seat, when he saw her car limping along with a flat. Stopping to help was second nature, he'd done it 100 times before. Folks around here knew him for it. So why did it feel like he'd kicked a hornet's nest? The photograph sat heavy in his lap. He flipped it over, and there, in faded ink, was a date, July 12, 1978. Nearly 50 years ago. His brow furrowed. He'd been a young man then, wrench in hand, working at the garage in town. Life was simpler, long days, cold beers, and dreams of something bigger. But nothing stood out. No kid, no bike, no clue. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. He stood and peered through the curtains again, half expecting the SUV to be back. The street was empty, but the unease stayed. He wasn't one for paranoia. Years of hard work had made him steady, practical, but this was different. That stranger's words stuck like burrs. You don't know what you've started. Started what? Helping a woman with a flat tire? It didn't add up. He tucked the photo into his shirt pocket and headed to the kitchen for a glass of water. His hand shook a little as he filled it, and he cursed under his breath. He wasn't young anymore, but he wasn't frail either. Whatever this was, he'd face it. He'd faced worse. But as he sipped the water, staring out at the dark fields, a question gnawed at him. What had he done by stopping on that road? And why did it feel like the answer was creeping closer, whether he wanted it or not? The mechanic couldn't sleep. The photograph burned a hole in his pocket, and the stranger's words rattled around in his head like loose bolts in a toolbox. He climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, each step creaking under his weight. The air up there was thick with dust and memories, the kind he'd spent years avoiding. He flicked on the bare bulb, its weak light spilling over stacks of cardboard boxes and old furniture draped in sheets. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but that photo, and the date on the back, pulled him here. July 12, 1978. He'd been in his 20s then, full of grit and grease, working long hours at the garage. Life had been loud and messy, but good. He'd had a best friend back then, a wiry guy with a quick laugh who'd drag him fishing on weekends. They'd made promises, dumb ones, like fixing up an old boat together or hitting the road someday. But that friend died young, a car wreck that left the mechanic numb for months. He hadn't thought about him in years. He knelt by a box labeled miscellaneous in his wife's neat handwriting, the ache of her absence tugging at him. Inside were faded Polaroids, yellowed letters, and a stack of garage receipts. He sifted through them, the paper rough against his fingers. A picture slipped out, a grainy shot of him and his friend, arms slung around each other, standing by a beat-up Chevy. The mechanic's chest tightened. He flipped it over. No date, but the memory hit hard. Summer, late 70s, the smell of oil and lake water. He kept digging, the attic floor cold against his knees. Another photo caught his eye, his friend again, this time with a kid. A boy, maybe 6, holding a fishing pole and grinning wide. The mechanic's breath hitched. He grabbed the stranger's photo from his pocket and held them side by side. The smile was the same. Same gap in the teeth, same tilt of the head. His hand shook as he stared. Was this the same kid? And if it was, why did that stranger think he'd started something? His friend had a sister, he remembered now. She'd been younger, wilder, always in and out of trouble. After the wreck, she'd drifted away, and the mechanic had let her go, too wrapped up in his own grief to chase after her. Could the boy be hers? He rubbed his eyes, the pieces jumbling together like a puzzle with half the bits missing. The woman on the road, her scared eyes, her shaky voice, maybe she was tied to this too. But how? A noise snapped him out of it. A soft thud, downstairs. He froze, ears straining. The wind, maybe? But it came again, deliberate, like footsteps. He switched off the bulb, plunging the attic into darkness, and crept to the stairs. His heart pounded, steady but loud, like it used to when he'd race engines as a kid. He wasn't armed, never kept a gun, never needed one, but he grabbed a rusty wrench from a shelf. Better than nothing. At the bottom of the stairs, he peered into the living room. Shadows stretched across the floor, the curtains swaying slightly. The front door was still locked, but something felt off. He stepped into the kitchen and saw it, a folded piece of paper on the floor by the back door, like someone had slipped it under. His mouth went dry. He picked it up, the wrench still gripped tight, and unfolded it. Meet me at the bridge. Midnight, it read, scrawled in black ink. No name, no explanation. He glanced at the clock, 11:15. The bridge was a mile out, an old wooden thing over the creek where he used to fish with his friend. He hadn't been there in years, not since the memories got too heavy. But now, it felt like the past was dragging him back, whether he liked it or not. He stood there, note in hand, the weight of it sinking in. This wasn't random. That woman, the SUV, the stranger, they were all threads tied to something he'd buried long ago. He could ignore it, lock the doors, and hope it went away. But he'd never been one to run from a problem. He'd fixed things his whole life, maybe this was one more thing that needed fixing. He grabbed his jacket, the wrench still in his fist, and headed for the door. The night outside was cold and still, but he felt it watching him. Whatever waited at the bridge, he'd face it. He had to. The mechanic's old pickup rattled down the dark road, headlights bouncing off the trees lining the way to the bridge. The wrench sat heavy on the passenger seat, a cold comfort against whatever waited for him. The clock on the dash glowed 11:45, plenty of time to get there, but his stomach churned like he was late for something big. The note crinkled in his jacket pocket, "Meet me at the bridge. Midnight." He didn't know who wrote it, but he had a hunch, the woman from the road, the one he'd helped. Her scared eyes flashed in his mind, and he gripped the wheel tighter. The bridge came into view, a sagging wooden thing over the creek, its planks weathered by years of rain and neglect. He used to fish here with his friend, laughing over tangled lines and warm beer. Now, the place felt different, quiet, almost haunted. He pulled off the road, tires crunching gravel, and cut the engine. The silence hit him hard, broken only by the soft gurgle of the water below. He stepped out, boots sinking into the damp earth, and scanned the shadows. A faint mist hung over the creek, curling around the bridge like fingers. He checked his watch, 11:58. 2 minutes to go. He leaned against the truck, the wrench in his hand, and waited. The air smelled of wet wood and moss, stirring memories he couldn't shake. That kid in the photo, his friend's nephew, maybe? The sister's boy? It was starting to fit, but the why of it all stayed out of reach. A twig snapped, and he straightened, heart kicking up a notch. Footsteps, light and quick, came from the far side of the bridge. A figure stepped into the dim glow of his headlights, the woman from the road. She looked smaller now, hunched in a thin coat, her hair falling over her face. She stopped a few feet away, eyes darting like a cornered animal. "You came," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Had to," he replied, keeping the wrench low but ready. "What's this about?" She took a shaky breath, glancing over her shoulder. "I didn't mean to drag you into it. I was just trying to get away, flat tire slowed me down. When you stopped, it changed things." "Changed what?" he pressed, stepping closer. "Who's after you?" "That SUV?" Her hands twisted together, knuckles white. "They're people I owe. Not money, a debt from a long time ago. You helping me, it messed up their plan. They think you're part of it now." He frowned, the words sinking in slow. "Part of what?" "Lady, I don't even know you." She opened her mouth to answer, but headlights flashed in the distance, cutting through the mist. Her face went pale. "They're here," she hissed, backing away. "I'm sorry, I can't stay." "Wait," he started, reaching out, but she bolted, disappearing into the trees on the other side of the bridge. The headlights grew brighter, the rumble of an engine closing in. He cursed under his breath and ducked behind his truck, peering over the hood. The black SUV rolled up, slow and deliberate, stopping just short of the bridge. Its doors stayed shut, but he could feel eyes on him. His pulse hammered. He wasn't built for this, not anymore. His knees ached from crouching, and his hands shook a little, but he tightened his grip on the wrench. The woman's words spun in his head, a debt, a plan, him tangled up in it. He'd just fixed her tire, how did that pull him into some kind of mess? But then he thought of the photo, the kid, his friend's sister. Maybe this wasn't about him at all, not yet. The SUV's engine revved once, sharp and loud, then went quiet. A door creaked open, and boots hit the ground. The same man from his porch stepped out, coat flapping in the breeze. He stood there, staring across the bridge, like he knew the mechanic was hiding. "You can't run from this," the man called, voice carrying over the water. "Not after what you did." The mechanic stayed low, breath shallow. What he did? He'd helped a stranger, that was it. But the man's tone, cold and sure, sent a chill down his spine. The stranger lingered a moment longer, then climbed back into the SUV. It peeled away, tires spitting gravel, leaving the night empty again. He stood, legs stiff, and stared at the spot where the woman had vanished. She'd left him with more questions than answers, and now that SUV was circling him like a shark. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. He climbed into his truck, the wrench still in hand, and started the engine. He'd figure it out, he always did. But first, he needed to get home and lock the doors tight. The mechanic's truck rumbled back toward home, the bridge fading in his rearview mirror. His hands gripped the wheel tight, the wrench bouncing on the seat beside him. The woman's words churned in his mind, "They think you're part of it now," and the stranger's voice echoed over the water, "You can't run from this." His headlights carved a path through the dark, but the night felt alive, pressing in on him from all sides. He was halfway home, winding through the backroads, when twin beams flared behind him. He glanced in the mirror. Headlights, close and gaining fast. His stomach dropped. The black SUV. It roared up, tailgating him, its grille a dark shadow in the glass. He pressed the gas, the old engine groaning as the speedometer ticked up. The road twisted ahead, narrow and lined with trees, no room for mistakes. "Come on, you old beast," he muttered, coaxing the truck forward. The SUV stayed glued to him, its horn blaring once, sharp and mean. His heart thudded against his ribs, a rhythm he hadn't felt since his racing days. Back then, it was thrill, now, it was fear, raw and heavy. He wasn't young anymore, but he still knew these roads like the back of his hand. He jerked the wheel, veering onto a side lane, a rutted dirt path he'd used to haul scrap years ago. The truck jolted over bumps, branches scraping the sides, but the SUV followed, its lights bouncing wildly. He pushed harder, tires kicking up dust, until the path split. Left went to town, right looped back through the woods. He swung right, praying the maze of turns would shake them. For a moment, it worked. The SUV's lights dimmed as he took another sharp curve, weaving through the trees. His breath came fast, sweat beading on his forehead. He didn't stop, didn't slow, until the road spat him out near the edge of his property. He pulled behind a cluster of pines, killed the engine, and waited, chest heaving. The night went still, no headlights, no roar. He'd lost them. For now. He drove the last stretch home slow, parking in the shadow of his barn. Inside, he locked the door and sank into his armchair, the wrench still in his lap. His hands shook as he rubbed his face. That chase, it wasn't just a warning. They wanted him scared, maybe worse. But why? He'd fixed a tire, nothing more. Yet here he was, heart racing like he'd run a marathon. He stood, restless, and checked the windows. The field stretched out dark and empty, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He poured a glass of water, downed it, then froze. Something white peeked out from under a stack of mail on the counter, an envelope that hadn't been there before. His gut twisted as he picked it up. No address, just his initials scratched in black ink. Inside was a newspaper clipping, brittle and faded. The headline hit him like a punch, "Local robbery ends in chaos, 1 dead, suspects flee." The date was July 1978. He skimmed it, 2 men and a woman hit a small bank, things went wrong, shots fired. One of the robbers died, the others got away. He remembered hearing about it back then, a story swapped over coffee at the garage. But it was just noise to him, until now. He sat hard, the clipping trembling in his hands. His friend's sister, wild, reckless, could she have been the woman in that crew? The dates lined up, and the kid in the photo, her son maybe, born around then. The woman on the road, her daughter? His head spun. Had he stumbled into some old score, unsettled after all these years? The SUV, the stranger, they weren't random. They were hunting something, and now they thought he had it. He folded the clipping and shoved it in his pocket with the photo. His mind raced, piecing it together. The sister, the robbery, the debt the woman mentioned, it was all tied to his friend, gone too soon. He'd promised to look out for her, way back when, but life got in the way. Guilt gnawed at him, sharp and old. Maybe that promise was catching up now. Outside, a dog barked somewhere far off, breaking the silence. He grabbed the wrench again and checked the locks one more time. The chase had shaken him, but it lit a fire too. He wasn't running, not from this. Whatever they wanted, he'd figure it out. He'd faced worse than a fast car and a dark night. Losing his wife, rebuilding alone, that had taken guts. This was just another fix, even if it scared him half to death. He settled back in the chair, eyes on the window. The SUV would be back, he knew it. But he'd be ready. The mechanic barely slept, dozing in his armchair with the wrench across his lap. Dawn crept through the curtains, painting the room in soft gray, but his mind was still racing. The newspaper clipping and the photo sat on the table, staring up at him like ghosts. He'd pieced together enough to know this wasn't random, his friend's sister, that robbery, the woman on the road, it all tied back to a promise he'd let slip through the cracks. But what did they want from him now? The phone rang, shrill and sudden, jolting him upright. He shuffled to the kitchen and picked it up, his voice rough. "Yeah?" "Been a while," came a gravelly voice on the other end. He froze. It was his old buddy from the garage days, the one who'd stuck around after the wreck, sharing quiet beers when words didn't cut it. They hadn't talked in months. "You okay?" the mechanic asked, gripping the receiver. "Me? Fine. You're the one in trouble, I hear." A pause, then, words going around, "Someone saw that black SUV tailing you last night." "What's going on?" The mechanic sank into a chair, rubbing his temple. "Wish I knew. Helped a woman with a tire, and now I've got strangers at my door and cars chasing me. Found an old clipping, bank job, 78. You remember that?" A low whistle came through the line. "That mess?" "Yeah. Your friend's sister was in deep, ran with a rough crowd. One died, she got out, but the third guy, he's still around. Bad news, that one. Word was, they stashed something after the job. Never found it." His stomach tightened. "Stashed what?" "No one knows, cash, maybe, or something hotter. She took off, had a kid. Folks say she's been hiding ever since, dodging that third guy. He's got a long memory." The mechanic's eyes flicked to the photo. The kid, her son. The woman, her daughter. It clicked. "That woman I helped, she's the kid's girl, isn't she? Running from him?" "Sounds like it," his buddy said. "If she's on the move, he's close. And if he thinks you're in on it." "He does," the mechanic cut in. "Left me a picture, chased me last night. Keeps saying I started something." A heavy sigh. "You stepped in it, all right. Helping her probably threw him off, she was supposed to be easy pickings. Now he's mad, and he thinks you've got whatever she's hiding." The mechanic stood, pacing. "I don't have anything. Just a wrench and a bad knee." "Then you better watch your back." He's not the type to ask nice. The call ended, and the mechanic stared out the window. The fields were still, but he felt the clock ticking. He'd helped the woman by chance, and now the shadow from the past was circling him. He wasn't a hero, just a guy who fixed things, but he couldn't walk away. Not with her scared face burned into his mind. Hours later, dusk settled in, and headlights flashed across the yard. He peeked out, the black SUV, parked bold as brass by his barn. His pulse quickened. No running this time. He grabbed the wrench and stepped onto the porch as the stranger climbed out, coat flapping in the wind. "You're a hard man to scare," the stranger said, stopping a few feet away. His voice was cold, eyes sharp under the hat. "Don't scare easy," the mechanic shot back, keeping the wrench low. "What do you want?" The stranger tilted his head. "You know what? She told you, didn't she? Where it's at." "She didn't tell me nothing. I fixed her tire, that's all." A smirk twisted the stranger's face. Fixed her tire, sure. And paid her debt. She was supposed to lead me to it, been tracking her for years. Then you show up, playing Good Samaritan. Now I'm thinking you've got it. "Got what?" he snapped, frustration boiling over. "I don't even know what you're after." The stranger stepped closer, voice dropping. "Something her mother took from me. Something worth more than you can imagine. Hand it over, and this ends." "I don't have it," the mechanic said, firm and steady. "Search the place if you want, I've got tools and coffee, nothing else." The stranger studied him, eyes narrowing. "Maybe you don't. But she does. And you're gonna help me find her." "No chance," he growled, raising the wrench. "Leave her be." The stranger chuckled, low and dark. "You're in over your head, old man. Last chance, help me, or I take it all apart." The mechanic stood his ground, heart pounding but sure. He'd lost too much in life to back down now. "Try it," he said, "and see what happens." The stranger stared, then turned back to the SUV, leaving the threat hanging in the air. The engine roared, and he was gone, for now. But the mechanic knew it wasn't over. He had to end this, one way or another. The mechanic stood on his porch, watching the black SUV's taillights vanish into the night. The stranger's threat lingered like smoke: help him find the woman. Or watch everything burn. His hand tightened around the wrench, the cold metal grounding him. He wasn't a fighter, not anymore, but he'd be damned if he let some thug tear apart what little piece he'd built. He'd lost his wife, his friend, years of his life to grief. He wasn't losing this too. He went inside, locked the door, and grabbed the phone. His buddy picked up on the second ring. "He was just here," the mechanic said, voice low. "Wants me to hand her over. Says she's got something from that robbery." A curse crackled through the line. "He's not bluffing. If he's that close, she's in deep. You too." "I'm not giving her up," he said. "She's scared, running for her life. I can't just sit here." A pause, then, "You're a stubborn old fool. All right, I'll make some calls, see if anyone knows where she's holed up. Stay put till I get back to you." The mechanic hung up and sank into his chair, the wrench still in hand. He stared at the photo of the kid, then the clipping. His friend's sister had messed up bad, robbed a bank, lost a partner, ran with whatever they'd taken. Her daughter was paying for it now, hunted by a man with a grudge. And him? He'd stumbled into it with a socket wrench and a soft heart. But maybe that was enough. The phone rang again an hour later. "She's at the old mill," his buddy said. "Friend of a friend saw her duck in there tonight. If you're going, go now, he won't be far behind." The mechanic grabbed his jacket and headed out, the truck rumbling to life. The mill was a crumbling relic on the edge of town, abandoned since the 80s. He pulled up under a sagging oak, headlights off, and spotted her car tucked behind a wall. His boots crunched on broken glass as he approached, wrench in hand. The air smelled of rust and damp wood. She was inside, crouched by a cracked window, peering out. She flinched when he stepped in, but relaxed when she saw his face. "You," she breathed. "Why were you here?" "To help," he said simply. "He came to my place. Wants whatever you've got." Her eyes darted to a duffel bag at her feet, then back to him. "It's not what he thinks. My mom, she didn't take cash. It's papers, proof he killed his partner back then. She kept it to protect us. He'll kill me for it." He nodded, the pieces locking in. "Then we end this. Together." Before she could argue, headlights swept the yard. The SUV rolled in, engine growling. The mechanic pulled her down behind a stack of crates. "Stay quiet," he whispered, peering through a gap. The stranger stepped out, a flashlight in one hand, something heavier in the other, a gun, glinting in the beam. The mechanic's heart pounded, but his mind raced faster. He'd fixed engines under pressure, this was no different. He whispered to her, "When I move, run for my truck. Don't stop." She nodded, eyes wide. He gripped the wrench and waited. The stranger's boots thudded. Closer, the light slicing through the dark. "I know you're here," the man called. "Make it easy, and the old man lives." The mechanic took a breath, then bolted up, hurling the wrench at the flashlight. It clattered to the ground, the beam spinning wild. The stranger cursed, firing a shot that splintered wood above their heads. "Go," the mechanic yelled, and she ran, duffel in hand. He ducked low, weaving through the crates as another shot rang out. His knee screamed, but he kept moving, drawing the stranger away. She made it to the truck, he heard the engine cough to life. "Good girl." The stranger turned, spotting her, but the mechanic lunged, tackling him into a rusty beam. They hit hard, the gun skidding across the floor. The man was strong, but the mechanic was heavier, years of hauling engines giving him an edge. He pinned him, fists clenched, until sirens wailed in the distance, his buddies doing, no doubt. The stranger snarled, but it was over. Cops swarmed in, cuffing him as the mechanic staggered back, breathing hard. Later, at the station, she handed over the papers, proof that ended a decades-old lie. She thanked him, tears in her eyes, and he just nodded. Driving home, the sky lightening, he felt the weight lift. He'd kept a promise he didn't know he'd broken, saved a life with a tire change and a bit of grit. Life wasn't about the big wins, he thought, it was the small ones, the ones you didn't see coming. And that was enough.